Part 3, Chapter 18 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 18. So long as Mr. Schwartz contrived to keep his position in the retail paint store, Una was busy at home, copying documents and specifications and form letters for a stenographic agency, and trying to make a science of quick and careful housework. She suspected that, now he had a little money again, Mr. Schwartz was being riotous with other women, as riotous as one can be in New York on $18 a week, with debts and a wife to interfere with his manly pleasures. But she did not care. She was getting ready to break the cocoon, and its grubbiness didn't much matter. Sex meant nothing between them now. She did not believe that she would ever be in love again, in any phase, noble or crude. While she aspired and worked, she lived like a nun in a cell. And now that she had something to do, she could be sorry for him. She made the best possible dinners for him on their gas range. She realized, sometimes, not often, for she was not a contemplative seer, but a battered woman, that their marriage had been as unfair to him as it was to her. In small-town boy-gang talks behind barns, in clerkly confidences as a young man, in the chatter of smoking cars and provincial hotel offices, he had been trained to know only two kinds of women, both very complacent to smart live wires: the bouncing lassies who laughed and kissed and would share with a man his pleasures, such as poker and cocktails and rapid motoring to no place in particular, and the meek, attentive, refined kind, the wives and mothers who cared for a man and admired him and believed whatever he told them about his business. Una was of neither sort for him, though for Walter Babson she might have been quite of the latter kind. Mr. Schwartz could not understand her, and she was as sorry for him as was compatible with a decided desire to divorce him and wash off the stain of his damp, pulpy fingers with the water of life. But she stayed home, and washed and cooked, and earned money for him, till he lost his retail store position by getting drunk and being haughty to a customer. Then the chrysalis burst, and Una was free again, free to labor, to endeavor, to die perhaps, but to die clean, to quest and meet whatever surprises life might hold. She couldn't go back to Troy Wilkins's, nor to Mr. S. Herbert Ross and the little Pemberton stenographers who had enviously seen her go off to be married. But she made a real business of looking for a job. While Mr. Schwartz stayed home and slept and got mental bed sores and drank himself to death, rather too slowly, on another $50 which he had borrowed after a Verdun campaign, Una was joyous to be out early, looking over advertisements, visiting typewriter companies' employment agencies. She was slow in getting work because she wanted $20 a week. She knew that any firm taking her at this wage would respect her far more than if she was an easy purchase. Work was slow to come, and she, who had always been so securely above the rank of paupers who submit to the dreadful surgery of charity, became afraid. She went at last to Mamie Magen. Mamie was now the executive secretary of the Hebrew Young Women's Professional Union. She seemed to be a personage. In her office she had a secretary who spoke of her with adoring awe, and when Una said that she was a personal friend of Miss Magen, the secretary cried, "Oh, then perhaps you'd like to go to her apartment at Washington Place. She's almost always home for tea at 5." The small, tired-looking Una, a business woman again, in her old tailor-made and a new small hat, walked longingly toward Washington Place and tea. In her 7 years in New York she had never known anybody except S. Herbert Ross who took tea as a regular function. It meant to her the gentlest of all forms of distinction, more appealing than riding in motors or going to the opera. That Mamie Magen had, during Una's own experience, evolved from a home club girl to an executive who had tea at her apartment every afternoon, was inspiriting, meeting her an adventure. An apartment of buff-colored walls and not bad prints was Mamie's, small but smooth, and taking tea in a manner which seemed to Una impressively suave were the insiders of the young charity workers' circle. But Mamie's uncouth face and eyes of molten heroism stood out among them all, and she hobbled over to Una and kissed her. When the cluster had thinned, she got Una aside and invited her to the Southern Kitchen on Washington Square. Una did not speak of her husband. "I want to get on the job again, and I wish you'd help me. I want something at 20 a week, I'm more than worth it, and a chance to really climb," was all she said, and Mamie nodded. And so they talked of Mrs. Harriet Fike of the Home Club, of dreams and work and the fight for suffrage. Una's marriage slipped away. She was ardent and unstained again. Mamie's nod was worth months of Mr. Schwartz's profuse masculine boasts. Within 10 days, Mamie's friend, Mr. Fine, of Truax and Fine, the real estate people, sent for Una and introduced her to Mr. Daniel T. Truax. She was told to come to work on the following Monday as Mr. Truax's secretary, at $21 a week. She went home defiant, determined to force her husband to let her take the job. She didn't need to use force. He, slippered and drowsy by the window, said, "That's fine. That'll keep us going till my big job breaks. I'll hear about it by next week, anyway. Then, in 3-4 weeks, you can kick Truax and Fine in the face and beat it. Say, girlie, that's fine. Say, tell you what I'll do. Let's have a little party to celebrate. I'll chase out and rush a growler of beer and some weenies." "No, I've got to go out again." "Can't you stop just long enough to have a little celebration? I been kind of lonely last few days, little sister. You been away so much, and I'm too broke to go out and look up the boys now." He was peering at her with a real wistfulness, but in the memory of Mamie Magen, the lame woman of the Golden Heart, Una could not endure his cackling enthusiasm about the job he would probably never get. "No, I'm sorry," she said, and closed the door. From the walk she saw him puzzled and anxious at the window. His face was becoming so ruddy and fatuous and babyish. She was sorry for him, but she was not big enough to do anything about it. Her sorrow was like sympathy for a mangy alley cat which she could not take home. She had no place to go. She walked for hours, planlessly, and dined at a bakery and lunchroom in Harlem. Sometimes she felt homeless, and always she was prosaically footsore, but now and then came the understanding that she again had a chance.
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.
Part 3, Chapter 19 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 19. So, toward the end of 1912, when she was 31 years old, Mrs. Una Golden Schwartz began her business career as confidential secretary to Mr. Truax of Truax and Fine. Her old enemy, routine, was constantly in the field. Routine of taking dictation, of getting out the letters, prompting Mr. Truax's memory as to who Mrs. A was and what Mr. B had telephoned, keeping plats and plans and memos in order, making out cards regarding the negotiations with possible sellers of suburban estates. She did not, as she had hoped, always find this routine one jolly round of surprises. She was often weary, sometimes bored. But in the splendor of being independent again, and of having something to do that seemed worth while, she was able to get through the details that never changed from day to day. And she was rewarded, for the whole job was made fascinating by human contact. She found herself enthusiastic about most of the people she met at Truax and Fine's. She was glad to talk with them, to work with them, to be taken seriously as a brain, a loyalty, a woman. By contrast with 2 years of hours either empty or filled with Schwartz, the office world was of the loftiest dignity. It may have been that some of the men she met were Schwartzes to their wives, but to her they had to be fellow workers. She did not believe that the long hours, the jealousies, the worry, or Mr. Truax's belief that he was several planes above ordinary humanity, were desirable or necessary parts of the life at Truax and Fine's. Here, too, she saw 9 hours of daily strain aging slim girls into skinny females. But now her whole point of view was changed. Instead of looking for the evils of the business world, she was desirous of seeing in it all the blessings she could, and, without ever losing her belief that it could be made more friendly, she was, nevertheless, able to rise above her own personal weariness, and see that the world of jobs, offices, business, had made itself creditably superior to those other muddled worlds of politics and amusement and amorous Schwartzes. She believed again, as in commercial college she had callowly believed, that business was beginning to see itself as communal, world-ruling, and beginning to be inspired to communal kingly virtues and responsibility. Looking for the good, sometimes in her joy of escape, looking for it almost with the joy of an S. Herbert Ross in picking little lucrative flowers of sentiment along the roadside, she was able to behold more daily happiness about her. Fortunately, Truax and Fine's was a good office, not too hard, not too strained and factional like Pemberton's, not wavering like Troy Wilkins's. Despite Mr. Truax's tendency to courteous whining, it was doing its work squarely and quietly. That was fortunate. Offices differ as much as office managers, and had chance condemned Una to another nerve-twanging Pemberton's, her slight strength might have broken. She might have fallen back to Schwartz and the gutter. Peaceful as reapers singing on their homeward path now seemed the teasing voices of men and girls as, in a group, they waited for the elevator at 5:35. The cheerful, "Good night, Mrs. Schwartz," was a vesper benediction, altogether sweet with its earnest of rest and friendship. Tranquillity she found when she stayed late in the deserted office. Here no Schwartz could reach her. Here her toil counted for something in the world's work, in the making of suburban homes for men and women and children. She sighed, and her breast felt barren, as she thought of the children. But tranquillity there was, and a brilliant beauty of the city, as across dark spaces of evening were strung the jewels of light, as in small French restaurants sounded desirous violins. On warm evenings of autumn, Una would lean out of the window and be absorbed in the afterglow above the North River, smoke clouds from Jersey factories drifting across the long carmine stain, air sweet and cool, and the yellow-lighted windows of other skyscrapers giving distant companionship. She fancied sometimes that she was watching the afterglow over a far northern lake among the pines, and with a sigh more of content than of restlessness she turned back to her work. Time ceased to exist when she worked alone. Of time and of the office she was manager. What if she didn't go out to dinner till 8? She could dine whenever she wanted to. If a clumsy man called Eddie Schwartz got hungry, he could get his own dinner. What if she did work slowly? There were no telephone messages, no Mr. Truax to annoy her. She could be leisurely and do the work as it should be done. She was no longer afraid of the rustling silence about her, as Una Golden had been at Troy Wilkins's. She was a woman now, and trained to fill the blank spaces of the deserted office with her own colored thoughts. Hours of bustling life in the daytime office had their human joys as well. Una went out of her way to be friendly with the ordinary stenographers, and, as there was no vast Pembertonian system of caste, she succeeded, and had all the warmth of their little confidences. Nor, after her extensive experience with Messrs. Schwartz, Sanderson, and McCullough, did even the noisiest of the salesmen offend her. She laughed at the small signs they were always bringing in and displaying. "Oh, forget it. I've got troubles of my own." Or, "Is that you again? Another half hour gone to hell." The sales manager brought this latter back from Philadelphia and hung it on his desk, and when the admiring citizenry surrounded it, Una joined them. As a married woman she was not expected to be shocked by the word hell. But most beautiful was Christmas Eve, when all distinctions were suspended for an hour before the office closed, when Mr. Truax distributed gold pieces and handshakes, when Chas, the hat-tilted sales manager, stood on a chair and sang a solo. Mr. Fine hung holly on all their desks, and for an hour stenographers and salesmen and clerks and chiefs all were friends. When she went home to Schwartz, she tried to take some of the holiday friendship. She sought to forget that he was still looking for the hypothetical job, while he subsisted on her wages and was increasingly apologetic. She boasted to herself that her husband hated to ask her for money, that he was large and strong and masculine. She took him to dinner at the Pequot, in a room of gold and tapestry, but he got drunk and wept into his sherbet that he was a drag on her, and she was glad to be back in the office after Christmas. The mist of newness had passed, that confusion of the recent arrival in office or summer hotel or revengeful reception, and she now saw the office inhabitants as separate people. She wondered how she could ever have thought that the sales manager and Mr. Fine were confusingly alike, or have been unable to get the salesmen's names right. There was the chief, Mr. Daniel T. Truax, usually known as D.T., a fussily courteous whiner with a rabbity face his pink nose actually quivered, a little yellow mustache, and a little round stomach. Himself and his business he took very seriously, though he was far less tricky than Mr. Pemberton. The Real Estate Board of Trade was impressed by his unsmiling insistence on the dignity of the profession, and always asked him to serve on committees. It was Mr. Truax who bought the property for subdevelopment, and though he had less abstract intelligence than Mr. Fine, he was a better judge of "what the people want," of just how high to make restrictions on property, and what whim would turn the commuters north or south in their quest for homes. There was the super chief, the one person related to the firm whom Una hated, Mrs. D.T. Truax. She was not officially connected with the establishment, and her office habits were irregular. Mostly they consisted in appearing at the most inconvenient hours and asking maddening questions. She was fat, massaged, glittering, wheezy-voiced, nagging. Una peculiarly hated Mrs. Truax's nails. Una's own fingertips were hard with typing. Her manicuring was a domestic matter of clipping and hypocritical filing. But to Mrs. Truax, manicuring was a life work. Because of much clipping of the cuticle, the flesh at the base of each nail had become a noticeably raised cushion of pink flesh. Her nails were too pink, too shiny, too shapely, and sometimes they were an unearthly white at the ends because of nail paste left under them. At that startling whiteness Una stared, all the while Mrs. Truax was tapping her fingers and prying into the private morals of the pretty hall girl, and enfilading Una with the lorgnon that so perfectly suited her Upper West Side jowls. Collating Mrs. Truax and the matrons of the visiting board of the Temperance Home Club, Una concluded that women trained in egotism, but untrained in business, ought to be legally enjoined from giving their views to young women on the job. The most interesting figure in the office was Mr. Fine, the junior partner, a Harvard Jew, who was perfectly the new type of business man. Serious, tall, spectacled, clean-shaven, lean-faced, taking business as a profession, and kindly justice as a religion, studying efficiency but hating the metamorphosis of clerks into machines, he was the distinction and the power of Truax and Fine. At first Una had thought him humorless and negligible, but she discovered that it was he who pulled Mr. Truax out of his ruts, his pious trickeries, his cramping economies. She found that Mr. Fine loved books and the opera, and that he could be boyish after hours. Then the sales manager, that driving but festive soul, Mr. Charles Salmond, whom everybody called Chaz, pronounced Chaz, a good soul who was a little tiresome because he was so consistently an anthology of New York. He believed in Broadway, the Follies, good clothes, a motor car, Palm Beach, and the value of the Salvation Army among the lower classes. When Mr. Fine fought for real beauty in their suburban developments, it was Chaz who echoed all of New York by rebelling. "We aren't in business for our health. This idealistic game is okay for the guys that have the cash, but you can't expect my salesmen to sell this simplicity and high-thinking stuff to prospects that are interested in nothing but a sound investment with room for a garage and 2 kids." 60 or 70 salesmen, clerks, girls, these Una was beginning to know. Finally, there was a keen, wide-awake woman, willing to do anything for anybody, not forward, but not to be overridden, a woman with a slight knowledge of architecture and a larger knowledge of the way of promotion, a woman whom Una took seriously, and the name of this paragon was Mrs. Una Golden Schwartz. Round these human islands flowed a sea of others. She had a sense of flux and change and energy, of hundreds of thousands of people rushing about her always, crowds on Broadway and Fifth Avenue and Sixth, and on 34th Street where stood the Zodiac Building in which was the office. Crowds in the hall of the Zodiac Building, examining the black and white directory board with its list of 200 offices, or waiting to surge into one of the 12 elevators, those packed vertical railroads. A whole village life in the hallway of the Zodiac Building, the imperial elevator starter in a uniform of blue and gold, and merely regal elevator runners with less gold and more faded blue. The oldest of the elevator boys, Harry the Greek, who knew everybody in the building. The cigar stand, with piles of cigarettes, cans of advertised tobacco, maple fudge wrapped in tin foil, stamps, and even a few cigars. Also the keeper thereof, an Italian with an air of swounding romance. More romantic Italians in the glass-enclosed barber shop, desperate Desmond devils, with white coats like undress uniforms, and mustaches that recalled the Riviera and Baccarat and a Secret Service count. The 2 manicure girls of the barber shop, princesses reigning among admirers from the offices upstairs. Janitors with brooms, and charwomen with pails. And a red, sarcastic man, the engineer, and a meek puppet who was merely the superintendent of the whole thing. Una watched these village people, to whom the Zodiac Hall was Main Street, and in their satisfied conformation to a life of marble floors and artificial light, she found such settled existence as made her feel at home in this town, with its 18 strata called floors. She, too, at least during the best hours of the day, lived in the Zodiac Building's microcosm. And to her office penetrated the ever-flowing crowds, salesmen, buyers of real estate, inquirers, persons who seemed to have as a hobby the collection of real estate folders. Indeed, her most important task was the strategy of handling callers, the callers who came to see Mr. Truax himself, and were passed on to Una by the hall girl. To the clever secretary, the management of callers becomes a question of scientific tactics, and Una was clever at it because she liked people. She had to recognize the type of awkward, shabby visitor who looks like a beggar, but has in his pocket the cash for investment in lots, and the insinuating caller, with tailor-made garments and a smart tie, who presents himself as one who yearns to do a good turn to his dear, dear personal friend Mr. D.T. Truax, but proves to be an insurance agent or a salesman of adding machines. She had to send away the women with high-pitched voices and purely imaginary business, who came in for nothing whatever, and were willing to spend all of their own time and Mr. Truax's in obtaining the same. Women with unsaleable houses to sell, or improbable lots to buy, dissatisfied clients or mere cranks, old, shattered, unhappy women, to whom Una could give sympathy but no time. She was expert at standing filially listening to them at the elevator, while all the time her thumb steadily pressed the elevator signal. Una had been trained, perhaps as much by enduring Mr. Schwartz as by pleasing Mr. S. Herbert Ross, to be firm, to say no, to keep Mr. Truax's sacred rights undisturbed. She did not conventionally murmur, "Mr. Truax is in a conference just now, and if you will tell me the nature of your business." Instead, she had surprising, delightful, convincing things for Mr. Truax to be doing, just at that particular moment. From Mr. Truax himself she learned new ways of delicately getting rid of people. He did not merely rise to indicate that an interview was over, but also arranged a system of counterfeit telephone calls, with Una calling up from the outside office, and Mr. Truax answering, "Yes, I'll be through now in just a moment," as a hint for the visitor. He even practiced such play acting as putting on his hat and coat and rushing out to greet an important but unwelcome caller with, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just going out. Late for important engagement. Give my secretary full instructions, and I know she'll take care of you just as well as I could personally," and returning to his private office by a rear door. Mr. Truax, like Mr. S. Herbert Ross, gave Una maxims, but his had very little to do with stars and argosies, and the road to success, and vivisection, and the abstract virtues. They concerned getting to the office on time, and never letting a customer bother him if an office salesman could take care of the matter. So round Una flowed all the energy of life, and she of the listening and desolate hotel room and the overshadowing storm clouds was happy again. She began to make friendships. Chas, the office manager, stopped often at her desk to ridicule, and Mr. Fine to praise, the plans she liked to make for garden suburbs, which should be filled with poets, thatched roofs, excellent plumbing, artistic conversation, fireplaces, incinerators, books, and convenient trains. "Some day," said Mr. Fine to her, "we'll do that sort of thing, just as the Sage Foundation is doing it at Forest Hills." And he smiled encouragingly. "Some day," said Mr. Truax, "when you're head of a women's real estate firm, after you women get the vote, and rusty, old-fashioned people like me are out of the way, perhaps you can do that sort of thing." And he smiled encouragingly. "Rot," said Chas, and amiably chucked her under the chin.
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.
Part 3, Chapter 20 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 20. Truax and Fine was the first firm toward which Una was able to feel such loyalty as is supposed to distinguish all young aspirants, loyalty which is so well spoken of by bosses, and which is so generally lacking among the bossed. Partly this was her virtue, partly it was the firm's, and partly it was merely the accident of her settling down. She watched the biological growth of Truax and Fine with fascination, was excited when they opened a new subdivision, and proudly read the half-page advertisements thereof in the Sunday newspapers. That loyalty made her study real estate, not merely stenography, for to most stenographers their work is the same whether they take dictation regarding real estate, or book publishing, or felt slippers, or the removal of taconite. They understand transcription, but not what they transcribe. She read magazines, System, Printer's Ink, Real Estate Record, solemnly studying Recorded Conveyances and Plans Filed for New Construction Work and Mechanics' Liens. She got ideas for houses from architectural magazines, garden magazines, women's magazines. But what most indicated that she was a real devotee was the fact that, after glancing at the front page headlines, the society news, and the joke column in her morning paper, she would resolutely turn to the real estate field. On Sundays she often led Mr. Schwirtz for a walk among the new suburban developments. For always, no matter what she did at the office, no matter how much Mr. Truax depended on her, or Mr. Fine praised her, she went home to the same cabbage-rose carpeted housekeeping room, and to a Mr. Schwirtz who had seemingly not stirred an inch since she had left him in the morning. Mr. Schwirtz was of a harem type, and not much adapted to rustic jaunting, but he obediently followed his master and tried to tell stories of the days when he had known all about real estate, while she studied model houses, the lay of the land, the lines of sewers and walks. That was loyalty to Truax and Fine as much as desire for advancement. And that same loyalty made her accept as fellow workers even the noisiest of the salesmen, and even Beatrice Joline. Though Mr. Truax didn't believe in women salesmen, one woman briskly overrode his beliefs, Miss Beatrice Joline, of the Gramercy Park Jolines, who cheerfully called herself one of the nouveaux pauvres, and condescended to mere Upper West Side millionaires, and had to earn her frocks and tea money. She earned them, too, but she declined to be interested in office regulations or office hours. She sold suburban homes as a freelance, and only to the very best people. She darted into the office now and then, slender, tall, shoulder-swinging, an exclamation point of a girl, in a smart check suit and a Bendel hat. She ignored Una with a coolness which reduced her to the status of a new stenographer. All the office watched Miss Joline with hypnotized envy. Always in offices those who have social position outside are observed with secret awe by those who have not. Once, when Mr. Truax was in the act of persuading an unfortunate property owner to part with a Long Island estate for approximately enough to buy one lot after the estate should be subdivided into 600 lots, Miss Joline had to wait. She perched on Una's desk, outside Mr. Truax's door, swung her heels, inspected the finger ends of her chamois gloves, and issued a command to Una to perform conversationally. Una was thinking, "I'd like to spank you, and then I'd adore you. You're what story writers call a thoroughbred." While unconscious that a secretary in a tabby gray dress and gold eyeglasses was venturing to appraise her, Miss Joline remarked in a high, clear voice, "Beastly bore to have to wait, isn't it? I suppose you can rush right in to see Mr. Truax any time you want to, Mrs. Schwirtz. Rotten name, isn't it?" Una smiled up condescendingly. Miss Joline stopped kicking her heels and stared at Una as though she might prove to be human, after all. "Oh, no, it's a very nice name," she said. "Fancy being called Joline. Now Schwartz sounds rather like Schenk, and that's one of the smartest of the old names. Would it be too much trouble to see if Mr. Truax is still engaged?" "He is. Miss Joline, I feel like doing something I've wanted to do for some time. Of course, we both know you think of me as that poor little dub, Mrs. What's-her-name, D.T.'s secretary." "Why, really! Or perhaps you hadn't thought of me at all. I'm naturally quite a silent little dub, but I've been learning that it's silly to be silent in business. So I've been planning to get hold of you and ask you where and how you get those suits of yours, and what I ought to wear. You see, after you marry I'll still be earning my living, and perhaps if I could dress anything like you, I could fool some businessman into thinking I was clever." "As I do, you mean?" said Miss Joline, cheerfully. "Well, oh, I don't mind. But, my dear good woman, oh, I suppose I oughtn't to call you that." "I don't care what you call me, if you can tell me how to make a 1750 suit look like Vogue. Isn't it awful, Miss Joline, that us lower classes are interested in clothes too?" "My dear girl, even the beautiful, the accomplished Beatrice Joline, I'll admit it, knows when she is being teased. I went to boarding school, and if you think I haven't ever been properly and thoroughly and oh, most painstakingly told what a disgusting natural snob I am, you ought to have heard Tomlinson, or any other of my dear friends, taking me down. I rather fancy you're kinder hearted than they are. But anyway, you don't insult me half so scientifically." "I'm so sorry. I tried hard. I'm a well-meaning insulter, but I haven't the practice." "My dear, I adore you. Isn't it lovely to be frank? When us females get into Mr. Truax's place, we'll have the most wonderful time insulting each other, don't you think? But really, please don't think I like to be rude. But you see, we Jolines are so poor that if I stopped it, all my business acquaintances would think I was admitting how poor we are. So I'm practically forced to be horrid. Now that we've been amiable to each other, what can I do for you? Does that sound businesslike enough?" "I want to make you give me some hints about clothes. I used to like terribly crude colors, but I've settled down to tessy things that are safe, this gray dress, and brown, and black." "Well, my dear, I'm the best little dressmaker you ever saw, and I do love to lay down the law about clothes. With your hair and complexion, you ought to wear clear blues. Order a well-made, be sure it's well-made, no matter what it costs. Get some clever little Jew socialist tailor off in the outskirts of Brooklyn, or some heathenish place, and stand over him. A well-made tailored suit of not too dark navy blue, with matching blue crêpe de chine blouses with nice soft white collars, and cuffs of crêpe or chiffon, and change 'em often." "What about a party dress? Ought I to have satin or chiffon or blue net, or what?" "Well, satin is too dignified, and chiffon too perishable, and blue net is too tessy. Why don't you try black net over black satin? You know there's really lots of color in black satin if you know how to use it. Get good materials, and then you can use them over and over again. Perhaps white chiffon over the black satin." "White over black?" Though Miss Joline stared down with one of the quick, secretive smiles which Una hated, the smile which reduced her to the rank of a novice, her eyes held Miss Joline, made her continue her oracles. "Yes," said Miss Joline, "and it isn't very expensive. Try it with the black net first, and have soft little folds of white tulle along the edge of the décolletage. It's scarcely noticeable, but it does soften the neckline. And wear a string of pearls. Get these Artifico pearls, $1.90 a string. Now you see how useful a snob is to the world? I'd never give you all this godlike advice if I didn't want to advertise what an authority I am on smart fashions for limited incomes." "You're a darling," said Una. "Come to tea," said Miss Joline. They did go to tea, but before it, while Miss Joline was being voluble with Mr. Truax, Una methodically made notes on the art of dress, and filed them for future reference. Despite the fact that, with the support of Mr. Schwirtz as her chief luxury, she had only $16 in the world, she had faith that she would sometime take a woman's delight in dress and a business woman's interest in it. This had been an important hour for her, though it cannot be authoritatively stated which was the more important, learning to dress, or learning not to be in awe of a Joline of Gramercy Park. They went to tea several times in the 5 months before the sudden announcement of Miss Joline's engagement to Wally Castle of the Tennis and Racquet Club. And at tea they bantered and were not markedly different in their use of forks or choice of pastry. But never were they really friends. Una, of Panama, daughter of Captain Golden and wife of Eddie Schwirtz, could comprehend Walter Babson and follow Mamie Magen, and even rather despised that Diogenes of an enameled tub, Mr. S. Herbert Ross, but it seemed probable that she would never be able to do more than ask for bread and railway tickets in the language of Beatrice Joline, whose dead father had been ambassador to Portugal and friend to Henry James and John Hay. It hurt a little, but Una had to accept the fact that Beatrice Joline was no more likely to invite her to the famous and shabby old house of the Jolines than was Mrs. Truax to ask her advice about manicuring. They did, however, have dinner together on an evening when Miss Joline actually seemed to be working late at the office. "Let's go to a Café des Enfants," said Miss Joline. "Such a party! And honestly, I do like their coffee and the nice shiny bathroom walls." "Yes," said Una. "It's almost as much of a party to me as running a typewriter. Let's go Dutch to the Martha Washington." "Very well, though I did want buckwheats and little sausages. Exciting." "Huh," said Una, who was unable to see any adventurous qualities in a viand which she consumed about twice a week. Miss Joline's clean litheness, her gaiety that had never been made timorous or grateful by defeat or sordidness, her whirlwind of nonsense, blended in a cocktail for Una at dinner. Schwirtz, money difficulties, weariness did not exist. Her only trouble in the entire universe was the reconciliation of her admiration for Miss Joline's amiable superiority to everybody, her jibes at the salesmen and even at Mr. Truax, with Mamie Magen's philanthropic socialism. So far as this history can trace, she never did reconcile them. She left Miss Joline with a laugh, and started home with a song, then stopped. She foresaw the musty room to which she was going, the slatternly incubus of a man, saw, with just such distinctness as had once dangled the stiff gray scrub rag before her eyes, Schwirtz's every detail: bushy chin, stained and collarless shirt, trousers like old chair covers. Probably he would always be like this. Probably he would never have another job. But she couldn't cast him out. She had married him, in his own words, as a good provider. She had lost the bet. She would be a good loser, and a good provider for him. Always, perhaps. Always that mass of spoiled babyhood waiting at home for her. Always apologetic and humble. She would rather have the old grumbling dominant male. She tried to push back the moment of seeing him again. Her steps dragged, but at last, inevitably, grimly, the house came toward her. She crept along the moldy hall, opened the door of their room, saw him. She thought it was a stranger, an intruder, but it was veritably her husband, in a new suit that was fiercely pressed and shaped, in new, gleaming oxblood shoes, with a haircut and a barber shave. He was bending over the bed, which was piled with new shirts, Afro-American ties, new toilet articles, and he was packing a new suitcase. He turned slowly, enjoying her amazement. He finished packing a shirt. She said nothing, standing at the door. Teetering on his toes and watching the effect of it all on her, he lighted a large cigar. "Some class, eh?" he said. "Well." "Nifty suit, eh? And how are those for swell ties?" "Very nice. From whom did you borrow the money?" "Now that certainly is a nice sweet way to congratulate friend hubby. Oh sure, man lands a job, works his head off getting it, gets an advance for some new clothes he's simply got to have, and of course everybody else congratulates him, everybody but his own wife. She sniffs at him, not a word about the new job, of course. First crack out of the box, she gets busy suspecting him and says, 'Who you been borrowing of now?' And this after always acting as though she was an abused little innocent that nobody appreciated." He was in mid-current, swimming strong, and waving his cigar above the foaming waters, but she pulled him out of it with, "I am sorry. I ought to have known. I'm a beast. I am glad, awfully glad you've got a new job. What is it?" "New company handling a new kind of motor for rowboats. Converts 'em to motorboats in a jiffy. Outboard motors, they call 'em. Got a swell territory and plenty bonus on new business." "Oh, isn't that fine? It's such a fine surprise. And it's cute of you to keep it to surprise me with all this while." "Well, as a matter of fact, I just got onto it today. Ran into Burke McCullough on 6th Avenue, and he gave me the tip." "Oh." A forlorn little "oh" it was. She had pictured him proudly planning to surprise her. And she longed to have the best possible impression of him, because of a certain plan which was hotly being hammered out in her brain. She went on, as brightly as possible. "And they gave you an advance? That's fine." "Well, no, they didn't, exactly, but Burke introduced me to his clothier, and I got a swell line of credit." "Oh." "Now, for the love of Pete, don't go ohing and awing like that. You've handed me the pickled visage since I got the rowdy dow on my last job. Good Lord, you acted like you thought I liked to sponge on you. Now let me tell you, I've kept account of every red cent you've spent on me, and I expect to pay it back." She tried to resist her impulse, but she couldn't keep from saying, as nastily as possible, "How nice. When?" "Oh, I'll pay it back all right, trust you for that. You won't fail to keep wising me up on the fact that you think I'm a drunken bum. You'll sit around all day in a hotel and take it easy and have plenty time to figure out all the things you can roast me for, and then spring them on me the minute I get back from a trip all tired out, like you always used to." "Oh, I did not!" she wailed. "Sure you did." "And what do you mean by my sitting around from now on?" "Well, what the hell else are you going to do? You can't play the piano or maybe run an aeroplane, can you?" "Why, I'm going to stay on my job, of course, Ed." "You are not going to of course stay on your job, Ed, any such a thing. Let me tell you that right here and now, my lady. I've stood just about all I'm going to stand of your top lofty independence and business airs, as though you weren't a wife at all, but just as be damned to you independent as though you were as much of a businessman as I am. No, sir, you'll do what I say from now on. I've been tied to your apron strings long enough, and now I'm the boss. See? Me!" He tapped his florid bosom. "You used to be plenty glad to go to poker parties and leg shows with me, when I wanted to, but since you've taken to earning your living again, you've become so ip-de-dee and independent that when I even suggest rushing a growler of beer you scowl at me, and as good as say you're too damn almighty good for Eddie Schwartz's lowbrow amusements. And you've taken to staying out all hours. Course it didn't matter whether I stayed here without a piece of change, or supper, or anything else, or any amusements, while you were out whoop-de-doodling around. You said it was with women." She closed her eyes tight. Then, wearily, "You mean, I suppose, that you think I was out with men." "Well, I ain't insinuating anything about what you been doing. You been your own boss, and of course I had to take anything off anybody as long as I was broke. But lemme tell you, from now on, no pasty-faced female is going to rub it in any more. You're going to try some of your own medicine. You're going to give up your rotten stenographer's job, and you're going to stay home where I put you. And when I invite you to come on a spree, you're going to be glad." Her face tightened with rage. She leaped at him, shook him by the shoulder, and her voice came in a shriek. "Now that's enough! I'm through! You did mean to insinuate I was out with men. I wasn't, but that was just accident. I'd have been glad to, if there'd been one I could have loved even a little. I'd have gone anywhere with him, done anything. And now we're through. I stood you as long as it was my job to do it. God, what jobs we women have in this chivalrous world that honors women so much. But now that you can take care of yourself, I'll do the same." "What do you mean?" "I mean this." She darted at the bed, yanked from beneath it her suitcase, and into it began to throw her toilet articles. Mr. Schwartz sat upon the bed and laughed enormously. "You women certainly are a sketch," he caroled. "Going back to Mama, are you? Sure. That's what the first Mrs. Schwartz was always doing. Let's see. Once she got as far as the depot before she came back and admitted that she was a chump. I doubt if you get that far. You'll stop on the step. You're too tightwad to hire a taxi, even to try to scare me and make it unpleasant for me." Una stopped packing, stood listening. Now, her voice unmelodramatic again, she replied, "You're right about several things. I probably was thoughtless about leaving you alone evenings, though it is not true that I ever left you without provision for supper. And of course you've often left me alone back there in the hotel, while you were off with other women." "Now who's insinuating?" He performed another characteristic peroration. She did not listen, but stood with warning hand up, a small but plucky-looking traffic policeman, till he ceased, then went on, "But I can't really blame you. Even in this day, when people like my friend Mamie Magen think that feminism has won everything, I suppose there must still be a majority of men like you, men who've never even heard of feminism, who think that their women are breed cattle. I judge that from the conversations I overhear in restaurants and streetcars, and these pretty vaudeville jokes about marriage that you love so, and from movie pictures of wives beating husbands, and from the fact that women even yet haven't the vote. I suppose that you don't really know many men besides the mucky cattle drover sort, and I can't blame you for thinking like them." "Say, what is all this cattle business about? I don't seem to recall we were discussing stockyards. Are you trying to change the conversation so you won't even have to pack your grip before you call your own bluff about leaving me? Don't get it at all, at all." "You will get it, my friend. As I say, I can see, now it's too late, how mean I must have been to you often. I've probably hurt your feelings lots of times." "You have, all right." "But I still don't see how I could have avoided it. I don't blame myself, either. We two simply never could get together. You're 2/3 the old-fashioned brute, and I'm at least 1/3 the new, independent woman. We wouldn't understand each other, not if we talked 1,000 years. Heavens alive! Just see all these silly discussions of suffrage that men like you carry on, when the whole thing is really so simple. Simply that women are intelligent human beings, and have the right—" "Now who mentioned suffrage? If you'll kindly let me know what you're trying to get at, then—" "You see, we two never could understand each other. So I'm just going to clean house, get rid of things that clutter it up. I'm going, tonight, and I don't think I shall ever see you again, so do try to be pleasant while I'm packing. This last time. Oh, I'm free again, and so are you, you poor, decent man. Let's congratulate each other." Despite the constant hammering of Mr. Schwartz, who changed swiftly from a tyrant to a bewildered orphan, Una methodically finished her packing, went to a hotel, and within a week found in Brooklyn, near the Heights, a pleasant white and green third-floor front. Her salary had been increased to $25 a week. She bought the blue suit and the crêpe de chine blouse recommended by Miss Beatrice Joline. She was still sorry for Mr. Schwartz. She thought of him now and then, and wondered where he had gone. But that did not prevent her enjoying the mirror's reflection of the new blouse. While he was dictating to Una, Mr. Truax monologized, "I don't see why we can't sell that Boutell family a lot. We wouldn't make any profit out of it now, anyway. That's nearly eaten up by the overhead we've wasted on them. But I hate to give them up. And your friend Mr. Fine says that we aren't scientific salesmen if we give up the office problems that everybody takes a whack at and seems to fail on." More and more Mr. Truax had been recognizing Una as an intelligence, and often he teased her regarding her admiration for Mr. Fine's efficiency. Now he seemed almost to be looking to her for advice as he plaintively rambled on. "Every salesman on the staff has tried to sell this asinine Boutell family and failed. We've got the lots. Give 'em anything from a $15,000 restriction, waterfront, high-class development, to an odd lot behind an Italian truck farm. They've been considering a lot at Villa Estates for a month now, and they aren't—" "Let me try them." "Let you try them?" "Try to sell them." "Of course, if you want to, in your own time, outside. This is a matter that the selling department ought to have disposed of. But if you want to try—" "I will. I'll try them on a Saturday afternoon. Next Saturday." "But what do you know about Villa Estates?" "I walked all over it just last Sunday. Talked to the resident salesman for an hour." "That's good. I wish all our salesmen would do something like that." All week Una planned to attack the redoubtable Boutells. She telephoned, sounding as well-bred and clever as she could, and made an appointment for Saturday afternoon. The Boutells were going to a matinee, Mrs. Boutell's grating voice informed her, but they would be pleased to see Mrs. Schwartz after the show. All week Una asked advice of Chas, the sales manager, who, between extensive exhortations to keep away from selling because it's the hardest part of the game, and believe me, it gets the least gratitude, gave her instructions in the tactics of presenting a proposition to a client, convincing a prospect of the salesman's expert knowledge of values, clinching the deal, talking points, and desirability of location. Wednesday evening Una went out to Villa Estates to look it over again, and she conducted a long imaginary conversation with the Boutels regarding the nearness of the best school in Nassau County. But on Saturday morning she felt ill. At the office she wailed on the shoulder of a friendly stenographer that she would never be able to follow up this, her first chance to advance. She went home at noon and slept till 4. She arrived at the Boutels' flat looking like a dead leaf. She tried to skip into the presence of Mrs. Boutel, a dragon with a frizz, and was heavily informed that Mr. Boutel wouldn't be back till 6, and that, anyway, they had talked over the Villa Estates proposition and decided it wasn't quite time to come to a decision. Be better to wait till the weather cleared up, so a body can move about. "Oh, Mrs. Boutel, I just can't argue it out with you," Una howled. "I do know Villa Estates and its desirability for you, but this is my very first experience in direct selling, and as luck would have it, I feel perfectly terrible today." "You poor lamb," soothed Mrs. Boutel. "You do look terrible sick. You come right in and lie down, and I'll have my Lithuanian make you a cup of hot beef tea." While Mrs. Boutel held her hand and fed her beef tea, Una showed photographs of Villa Estates and became feebly oratorical in its praises, and when Mr. Boutel came home at 6:30 they all had a light dinner together and went to the moving pictures, and through them talked about real estate, and at 11 Mr. Boutel uneasily took the fountain pen which Una resolutely held out to him, and signed a contract to purchase 2 lots at Villa Estates, and a check for the first payment. Una had climbed above the rank of assistant to the rank of people who do things.
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.
Part 3, Chapter 21 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 21. To Una and to Mr. Fine it seemed obvious that, since women have at least half of the family decision regarding the purchase of suburban homes, women salesmen of suburban property should be at least as successful as men. But Mr. Truax had a number of good, sound, conservative reasons why this should not be so, and therefore declined to credit the evidence of Una, Beatrice Joline, and saleswomen of other firms that it really was so. Yet, after solving the Boutel office problem, Una was frequently requisitioned by Chas to talk to women about the advantages of sites for themselves and their children, while regular and intelligent, that is, male, salesmen worked their hypnotic arts on the equally regular and intelligent men of the families. Where formerly it had seemed an awesome miracle, like chemistry or poetry, to close a deal and bring thousands of dollars into the office, now Una found it quite normal. Responsibility gave her more poise and willingness to take initiative. Her salary was raised to $30 a week. She banked $200 of commissions, and bought a Japanese blue silk negligee, a wristwatch, and the gown of black satin and net recommended by Miss Joline. Yet officially she was still Mr. Truax's secretary. She took his dictation and his moods. Her greatest reward was in the friendship of the careful, diligent Mr. Fine. She never forgot a dinner with Mr. Fine, at which, for the first time, she heard a complete defense of the employer's position, saw the office world from the standpoint of the bosses. "I never believed I'd be friendly with one of the capitalists," Una was saying at their dinner. "But I must admit that you don't seem to want to grind the faces of the poor." "I don't. I want to wash 'em." "I'm serious." "My dear child, so am I," declared Mr. Fine. Then, apparently addressing his mixed grill, he considered, "It's nonsense to say that it's just the capitalists that ail the world. It's the slackers. Show me a man that we can depend on to do the necessary thing at the necessary moment without being nudged, and we'll keep raising him before he has a chance to ask us, even." "No, you don't. That is, I really think you do, Mr. Fine, personally. But most bosses are so afraid of a big payroll that they deliberately discourage their people till they lose all initiative. I don't know. Perhaps they're victims along with their employees. Just now I adore my work, and I do think that business can be made as glorious a profession as medicine or exploring or anything. But in most offices, it seems to me, the biggest ideal the clerks have is safety. A two-family house on a stupid street in Flatbush as a reward for being industrious. Doesn't matter whether they enjoy living there, if they're just secure. And you do know, Mr. Truax doesn't, but you do know, that the whole office system makes pale, timid, nervous people out of all the clerks." "But good heavens, child, the employers have just as hard a time. Talk about being nervous. Take it in our game. The salesman does the missionary work, but the employer is the one who has to worry. Take some big deal that seems just about to get across, and then falls through just when you reach for the contract and draw a breath of relief. Or say you've swung a deal and have to pay your rent and office force, and you can't get the commission that's due you on an accomplished sale. And your clerks dash in and want a raise, under threat of quitting, just at the moment when you're wondering how you'll raise the money to pay them their present salaries on time. Those are the things that make an employer a nervous wreck. He's got to keep it going. I tell you, there's advantages in being a wage slave and having the wages coming."
"But, Mr. Fine, if it's just as hard on the employers as it is on the employees, then the whole system is bad."
"Good Lord, of course it's bad. But do you know anything in this world that isn't bad, that's anywhere near perfect? Except maybe Bach fugues. Religion, education, medicine, war, agriculture, art, pleasure, anything. All systems are choked with clumsy, outworn methods and ignorance. The whole human race works and plays at about 10% efficiency. The only possible ground for optimism about the human race that I can see is that in most all lines experts are at work showing up the deficiencies, proving that alcohol and war are bad, and consumption and Greek unnecessary, and making a beginning. You don't do justice to the big offices and mills where they have real efficiency tests, and if a man doesn't make good in one place, they shift him to another."
"There aren't very many of them. In all the offices I've ever seen, the boss's indigestion is the only test of employees."
Yes, I know, but that isn't the point. The point is that they are making such tests, beginning to. Take the schools where they actually teach future housewives to cook and sew as well as to read aloud. But, of course, I admit the very fact that there can be and are such schools and offices is a terrible indictment of the slatternly schools and bad-tempered offices we usually do have. And if you can show up this system of shutting people up in treadmills, why, go to it, and good luck. The longer people are stupidly optimistic, the longer we'll have to wait for improvements. But believe me, my dear girl, for every ardent radical who says the whole thing is rotten, there's 10 clever advertising men who think it's virtue to sell new brands of soap powder that are no better than the old brands, and 100 old codgers who are so broken in to the office system that they think they are perfectly happy, don't know how much fun in life they miss. Still, they're no worse than the adherents to any other paralyzed system. Look at the comparatively intelligent people who fall for any freak religious system and let it make their lives miserable. I suppose that when the world has no more war or tuberculosis, then offices will be exciting places to work in, but not till then. And meantime, if the typical businessman with a taste for fishing heard even so mild a radical as I am, he'd sniff, "The fellow don't know what he's talking about. Everybody in all the offices I know is perfectly satisfied."
Yes, changes will be slow, I suppose, but that doesn't excuse bosses of today for thinking they are little tin gods.
No, of course it doesn't. But people in authority always do that. The only thing we can do about it is for us, personally, to make our offices as clean and amusing as we can, instead of trying to buy yachts. But don't ever think either that capitalists are a peculiar race of fiends, different from anarchists or scrub women, or that we'll have a millennium about next election. We've got to be anthropological in our view. It's taken the human race about 500,000 years to get where it is, and presumably it will take quite a few thousand more to become scientific, or even to understand the need of scientific conduct of everything. I'm not at all sure that there's any higher wisdom than doing a day's work, and hoping the subway will be a little less crowded next year, and in voting for the best possible man, and then forgetting all the Weltschmerz and going to an opera. It sounds pretty raw and crude, doesn't it? But living in a world that's raw and crude, all you can do is to be honest and not worry.
Yes, said Una. She grieved for the sunset-colored ideals of Mamie Magen, for the fine, strained, hysterical enthusiasms of Walter Babson, as an enchantment of thought which she was dispelling in her effort to become a good, sound, practical business-woman. Mr. Fein's drab, opportunist philosophy disappointed her. Yet, in contrast to Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Truax, and Chaz, he was hyperbolic, and after their dinner she was gushingly happy to be hearing the opportunist melodies of Il Trovatore beside him. The Merryton Realty Company had failed, and Truax and Fine were offered the small development property of Crosshampton Hill Gardens at so convenient a price that they could not refuse it, though they were already carrying as many properties as they could easily handle. In a characteristic monologue, Mr. Truax asked a select audience, consisting of himself, his inkwell, and Una, what he was to do. "Shall I try to exploit it and close it out quick? I've got half a mind to go back to the old tent and brass band method and auction it off. The salesmen have all they can get away with. I haven't even a good, reliable resident salesman I could trust to handle it on the grounds." "Let me try it," said Una. "Give me a month's trial as salesman on the ground, and see what I can do. Just run some double-leaded classified ads and forget it. You can trust me, you know you can. Why, I'll write my own ads even. View of Long Island Sound and beautiful rolling hills, near to family yacht club with swimming and sailing.
I know I could manage it." Mr. Truax pretended not to hear, but she rose, leaned over his desk, stared urgently at him, till he weakly promised, "Well, I'll talk it over with Mr. Fine, but you know it wouldn't be worth a bit more salary than you're getting now. And what would I do for a secretary?" "I don't worry about salary. Think of being out on Long Island, now that spring is coming. And I'll find a successor and train her." "Well," said Mr. Truax, while Una took her pencil and awaited dictation, with a heart so blithe that she could scarcely remember the symbols for "Yours of 16th instant received."
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.
Part 3, Chapter 22 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 22. Of the year and a half, from March 1914 to the autumn of 1915, which Una spent on Long Island as the resident salesman and director of Crosshampton Hill Gardens, this history has little to say, for it is a treatise regarding a commonplace woman on a job, and at the Gardens there was no job at all, but one long summer day of flushed laughter. It is true that values were down on the North Shore at this period, and sales slow. It is true that Una, in high tan boots and a tweed suit from a sporting goods house, supervised carpenters in constructing a bungalow as local office and dwelling place for herself. It is true that she quarreled with the engineer planning the walks and sewers, usurped authority and discharged him, and had to argue with Mr. Truax for 3 hours before he sustained her decision. Also, she spent an average of 9 hours a day in waiting for people, or in showing them about, and serving tea and biscuits to dusty female villa hunters. And she herself sometimes ran a lawn-mower and cooked her own meals. But she had respect, achievement, and she ranged the open hills from the stirring time when dogwood blossoms filled the ravines with a fragrant mist, round the calendar and on till the elms were gorgeous with a second autumn, and sunsets marched in naked glory of archangels over the Connecticut hills beyond the flaming waters of Long Island Sound. Slow-moving but gentle were the winter months, for she became a part of the commuting town of Crosshampton Harbor, not as the negligible daughter of a Panama Captain Golden, but as a woman with the glamour of independence, executive position, city knowledge, and a certain marital mystery. She was invited to parties at which she obediently played bridge, to dances at the Harbor Yacht Club, to meetings of the Village Friendly Society. A gay, easy-going group, with cocktail mixers on their sideboards, and motors in their galvanized iron garages, but also with savings bank books in the drawers beneath their unit bookcases, took her up as a woman who had learned to listen and smile. And she went with them to friendly, unexacting dances at the Year-Round Inn, conducted by Charlie Duquesne, in the impoverished Duquesne mansion on Smiley Point. She liked Charlie, and gave him advice about bedroom chintzes for the inn, and learned how a hotel is provisioned and served. Charlie did not know that her knowledge of chintzes was about 2 weeks old, and derived from a buyer at Wanamacy's. He only knew that it solved his difficulties. She went into the city about once in 2 weeks, just often enough to keep in touch with Truax, Fine, Chas, and Mamie Magen, the last of whom had fallen in love with a socialistic Gentile Charities secretary, fallen out again, and was quietly dedicating all her life to Hebrew charities. Una closed the last sale at Crosshampton Hill Gardens in the autumn of 1915, and returned to town, to the office world and the job. Her record had been so clean and promising that she was able to demand a newly created position, woman sales manager, at $2,500 a year, selling direct and controlling 5 other women salesmen. Mr. Truax still "didn't believe in" women salesmen, and his lack of faith was more evident now that Una was back in the office. Una grew more pessimistic as she realized that his idea of women salesmen was a pure, high, aloof thing which wasn't to be affected by anything happening in his office right under his nose. But she was too busy selling lots, instructing her women aides, and furnishing a 4-room flat near Stuyvesant Park to worry much about Mr. Truax. And she was sure that Mr. Fein would uphold her. She had the best of reasons for that assurance, namely that Mr. Fein had hesitatingly made a formal proposal for her hand in marriage. She had refused him for 2 reasons: that she already had one husband somewhere or other, and the more cogent reason that though she admired Mr. Fein, found him as cooling and pleasant as lemonade on a July evening, she did not love him, did not want to mother him, as she had always wanted to mother Walter Babson, and as, now and then, when he had turned to her, she had wanted to mother even Mr. Schwirtz. The incident brought Mr. Schwirtz to her mind for a day or 2, but he was as clean gone from her life as was Mr. Henry Carson of Panama. She did not know, and did not often speculate, whether he lived or continued to die. If the world is very small, after all, it is also very large, and life and the world swallow up those whom we have known best, and they never come back to us. Una had, like a freshman envying the seniors, like a lieutenant in awe of the council of generals, always fancied that when she became a real executive with a salary of several thousands, and people coming to her for orders, she would somehow be a different person from the good little secretary. She was astonished to find that in her private office and her new flat, and in her new velvet suit, she was precisely the same yearning, meek, efficient woman as before. But she was happier. Despite her memories of Schwirtz, and the fear that sometime, someplace, she would encounter him and be claimed as his wife, and despite a less frequent fear that America would be involved in the great European war, Una had solid joy in her office achievements, in her flat, in taking part in the vast suffrage parade of the autumn of 1915, and feeling comradeship with thousands of women. Despite Mr. Fein's picture of the woes of executives, Una found that her new power and responsibility were inspiring, as her little stenographer's wage had never been. Nor, though she did have trouble with the women responsible to her at times, though she found it difficult to secure employees on whom she could depend, did Una become a female Troy Wilkins. She was able to work out some of the aspirations she had cloudily conceived when she had herself been a slave. She did find it possible to be friendly with her aides, to be on tea and luncheon and gossip terms of intimacy with them, to confide in them instead of tricking them, to use frank explanations instead of arbitrary rules, and she was rewarded by their love and loyalty. Her chief quarrels were with Mr. Truax in regard to raising the salaries and commissions of her assistant saleswomen. Behind all these discoveries regarding the state of being an executive, behind her day's work and the evenings at her flat when Mamie Magen and Mr. Fein came to dinner, there were two tremendous secrets. For her personal life, her life outside the office, she had found a way out such as might, perhaps, solve the question of loneliness for the thousands of other empty-hearted, fruitlessly aging office women. Not love of a man. She would rather die than have Schwartz's clumsy feet trampling her reserve again. And the pleasant men who came to her flat were just pleasant. No, she told herself, she did not need a man or man's love. But a child's love and presence she did need. She was going to adopt a child. That was her way out. She was 34 now, but by 6 of an afternoon she felt 40. Youth she would find, youth of a child's laughter and the healing of its downy sleep. She took counsel with Mamie Magen, who immediately decided to adopt a child also, and praised Una as a discoverer, and with the good housekeeping women she knew at Crosshampton Harbor. She was going to be very careful. She would inspect a dozen different orphan asylums. Meanwhile, her second secret was making life pregnant with interest. She was going to change her job again, for the last time, she hoped. She was going to be a creator, a real manager, unhampered by Mr. Truax's unwillingness to accept women as independent workers, and by the growing animosity of Mrs. Truax. Una's interest in the year-round inn at Crosshampton Harbor, the results obtained by reasonably good meals and a little chintz, and her memory of the family hotel, had led her attention to the commercial possibilities of innkeeping. She was convinced that, despite the ingenuity and care displayed by the managers of the great urban hotels and the clever resorts, no calling included more unimaginative slackers than did innkeeping. She had heard traveling men at Pemberton's and at Truax and Fein's complain of sour coffee and lumpy beds in the hotels of the smaller towns, of knives and forks that had to be wiped on the napkins before using, of shirt-sleeved proprietors who loafed within reach of the cuspidors while their wives tried to get the work done. She began to read the Hotel News and the Hotel Bulletin, and she called on the manager of a supply house for hotels. She read in the Bulletin of Bob Sidney, an ex-traveling man who, in partnership with a small capitalist, had started a syndicate of inns. He advertised, "The White Line Hotels. Fellow drummers, when you see the White Line sign hung out, you know you're in for good beds and good coffee." The idea seemed good to her. She fancied that traveling men would go from one White Line hotel to another. The hotels had been established in a dozen towns along the Pennsylvania Railroad, in Norristown, Reading, Williamsport, and others, and now Bob Sidney was promising to invade Ohio and Indiana. The blazed white line across the continent caught Una's growing commercial imagination, and she liked several of Mr. Sidney's ideas. The hotels would wire ahead to others of the line for accommodations for the traveler, and a man known to the line could get credit at any of its houses, by being registered on identifying cards. She decided to capture Mr. Sidney. She made plans. In the spring she took a mysterious 2 weeks' leave of absence and journeyed through New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. The woman who had quite recently regarded it as an adventure to go to Brooklyn was so absorbed in her big idea that she didn't feel self-conscious, even when she talked to men on the train. If they smacked their lips and obviously said to themselves, "Gee, this is easy, not a bad little dame," she steered them into discussing hotels, what they wanted at hotels and didn't get, what was their favorite hotel in towns in from 1,500 to 40,000 inhabitants, and precisely what details made it the favorite. She stayed at 2 or 3 places a day for at least one meal, hotels in tiny towns she had never heard of, and in larger towns that were fumbling for metropolitanism. She sought out all the summer resorts that were open so early. She talked to travelers, men and women, to hack drivers and to grocers supplying hotels, to proprietors and their wives, to clerks and waitresses and bellboys and unconsidered observant porters. She read circulars and the catalogues of furniture establishments. Finally, she visited each of Mr. Bob Sidney's White Line hotels. Aside from their arrangements for accommodations and credit, their superior cleanliness, good mattresses, and coffee with a real taste, she did not find them preferable to others. In their rows of cuspidors and shouldering desks, and barren offices hung with insurance calendars, and dining rooms ornamented with portraits of decomposed ducks, they were typical of all the hotels she had seen. On the train back to New York she formulated her suggestions for hotels, among which, in her own words, were the following: 1. Make the offices decent rooms. Remember living room at Gray Wolf Lodge. Take out desks. Guests to register and pay bills in small office off living room. Keep letters there too. Not much room needed and can't make pleasant room with miserable old desk sticking out into it. 2. Cut out the cuspidors. Have special room where drummers can play cards and tell stories and spit. Allow smoking in office, but make it pleasant. Remember chintz and wicker chairs at $3 each. Small round tables with reading lamps. Maybe fireplace. 3. Better pastry and soup, and keep coffee up to standard. One surprise in each meal, for example, novel form of eggs, good salad, or canned lobster cocktail. Remember the same old pork, beans, corned beef, steak, deadly cold boiled potato everywhere I went. 4. More attractive dining rooms, especially small tables for 2 and 4. Cater more to local customers with a la carte menus, not long, but good. 5. Women housekeepers, and pay 'em good. 6. Hygienic kitchens, and advertise 'em. 7. Train employees, as Remember Traveling Man told me United Cigar Stores do. 8. Better accommodations for women. Remember several traveling men's wives told me they would go on many trips with husbands if they could get decent hotels in all these towns. 9. Not ape New York hotels. Nix on gilt and palms and marble. But clean and tasty food. And don't have things like desks just because most hotels do. 3 hours after Una reached New York, She telephoned to the object of her secret commercial affections, the unconscious Mr. Robert Sidney, at the White Line Hotel's office. She was so excited that she took 10 minutes for calming herself before she telephoned. Every time she lifted the receiver from its hook, she thrust it back and mentally apologized to the operator. But when she got the office and heard Mr. Bob Sidney's raw voice shouting, "Yas, this is Mrs. Sidney," Una was very cool. "This is Mrs. Schwartz, realty salesman for Truax and Fine. I've just been through Pennsylvania, and I stayed at your White Line hotels. Of course, I have to be an expert on different sorts of accommodations, and I made some notes on your hotels, some suggestions you might be glad to have. If you care to, we might have lunch together tomorrow, and I'll give you the suggestions." Why. Of course, I'm rather busy with our new Long Island operations, so if you have a date tomorrow, the matter can wait. But I thought you'd better have the suggestions while they were fresh in my mind. But perhaps I can lunch with you week after next if...
No, let's make it tomorrow.
Very well. Will you call for me here, Truax and Fine, Zodiac Building? Una arose at 6:30 next morning to dress the part of the great businesswoman, and before she went to the office she had her hair waved. Mr. Bob Sidney called for her. He was a simple, energetic soul, with a derby on the back of his head, cheerful, clean-shaven, large-chinned, hoarse-voiced, rapidly revolving a chewed cigar. She, the commonplace, was highly evolved in comparison with Mr. Sidney, and there was no nervousness in her as she marched out in a $20 hat and casually said, "Let's go to the Waldorf. It's convenient and not at all bad." On the way over, Mr. Sidney fairly massaged his head with his agitated derby, cocked it over one eye and pushed it back to the crown of his head, in his efforts to find out what and why was Mrs. Una Schwartz. He kept appraising her. It was obvious that he was trying to decide whether this mysterious telephone correspondent was an available widow who had heard of his charms. He finally stumbled over the grating beside the Waldorf and bumped into the carriage starter and dropped his dead cigar. But all the while Una steadily kept the conversation to the vernal beauties of Pennsylvania. Thanks to rice powder and the pride of a new hat, she looked cool and adequate. But she was thinking all the time, "I never could keep up this Beatrice Joline pose with Mr. Fine or Mr. Ross. Poor Una, with them she'd just have to blurt out that she wanted a job." She sailed up to a corner table by a window. The waiter gave the menu to Mr. Sidney, but she held out her hand for it. "This is my lunch. I'm a business woman, not just a woman," she said to Mr. Sidney, and she rapidly ordered a lunch which was shockingly imitative of one which Mr. Fine had once ordered for her.
"Pretty hot day for April," said Mr. Sidney.
"Yes. Is the White Line going well?"
"Yump, doing a land office business."
"You're having trouble with your day clerk at Brockenfelt, I see."
"How'd you know?"
"Oh," she merely smiled.
"Well, that guy's a four-flush. Came to us from the New Willard, and to hear him tell it you'd think he was the guy that put the will in the Willard. But he's a credit grabber, that's what he is. Makes me think. Never forget one time I was up in Boston, and I met a coon porter, and he told me he was a friend of the president of the Pullman Company, and had persuaded him to put on steel cars. Bet a hat he believed it himself. That's about like this fellow. He's going to get the razoo. Gee, I hope you ain't a friend of his."
Una had perfectly learned the Boeotian dialect so strangely spoken by Mr. Sidney, and she was able to reply, "Oh, no, indeed. He ought to be fired. He gave me a room as though he were the superintendent of a free lodging house." "But it's so hard to get trained employees that I hate to even let him go. Just to show you the way things go, just when I was trying to swing a deal for a new hotel, I had to bust off negotiations and go and train a new crew of chambermaids at Sansonville myself. You died laughing to seen me making beds and teaching those birds to clean a spitador, begging your pardon. But it certainly was some show, and I do, by gum, know a traveling man likes his bed tucked in at the foot. Oh, it's fierce. The traveling public kicks if they get bum service, and the help kick if you demand any service from 'em, and the boss gets it right in the collar button both ways from the ace."
"Well, I'm going to tell you how to have trained service and how to make your hotels distinctive. They're good hotels, as hotels go, and you really do give people good coffee and good beds and credit conveniences, as you promise, but your hotels are not distinctive. I'm going to tell you how to make them so."
Una had waited till Mr. Sidney had disposed of his soup and filet mignon. She spoke deliberately, almost sternly. She reached for her new silver-link bag, drew out immaculate typewritten schedules, and while he gaped she read to him precisely the faults of each of the hotels, her suggested remedies, and her general ideas of hotels, with less cuspidors, more originality, and a room where traveling men could be at home on a rainy Sunday.
"Now you know, and I know," she wound up, "that the proprietor's ideal of a hotel is one to which traveling men will travel 60 miles on Saturday evening in order to spend Sunday there. You take my recommendations and you'll have that kind of hotels. At the same time women will be tempted there, and the local trade will go there when wife or the cook is away, or they want to give a big dinner."
"It does sound like it had some possibilities," said Mr. Sidney, as she stopped for breath, after quite the most impassioned invocation of her life. She plunged in again.
"Now, the point of all this is that I want to be the general manager of certain departments of the line, catering, service, decoration, and so on. I'll keep out of the financial end, and we'll work out the buying together. You know it's women who make the homes for people at home, and why not the homes for people traveling? I'm woman sales manager for Truax & Fine, sell direct, and 6 women under me. I'll show you my record of sales. I've been secretary to an architect, and studied architecture a little, and plenty other jobs. Now you take these suggestions of mine to your office and study 'em over with your partner, and we'll talk about the job for me by and by." She left him as quickly as she could, got back to her office, and in a shaking spasm of weeping relapsed into the old timorous Una. Tedious were the negotiations between Una and Mr. Sidney and his partner. They wanted her to make their hotels, and yet they had never heard of anything so nihilistic as actually having hotel offices without desks. They wanted her, and yet they didn't quite know about adding any more overhead at this stage of the game. Meantime, Una sold lots and studied the economical buying of hotel supplies. She was always willing to go with Mr. Sidney and his partner to lunch, but they were brief lunches. She was busy, she said, and she had no time to "drop in at their office." When Mr. Sidney once tried to hold her hand, not seriously, but with his methodical system of never failing to look into any possibilities, she said sharply, "Don't try that. Let's save a lot of time by understanding that I'm what you would call straight." He apologized and assured her that he had known she was a high-class genuine lady all the time.
The very roughness which, in Mr. Schwartz, had abrased her, interested her in Mr. Sidney. She knew better now how to control human beings. She was fascinated by a comparison of her 4 average citizens, 4 men not vastly varied as seen in a streetcar, yet utterly different to one working with them. Schwartz the lumbering, Troy Wilkins the roaring, Truax the politely whining, and Bob Sidney the hesitating. The negotiations seemed to arrive nowhere. Then, unexpectedly, Bob Sidney telephoned to her at her flat one evening. "Partner and I have just decided to take you on, if you'll come at $3,800 a year." Una hadn't even thought of the salary. She would gladly have gone to her new creative position at the $3,200 she was then receiving, but she showed her new training and demanded $4,200. "Well, split the difference and call it $4,000 for the first year." "All right." Una stood in the center of the room. She had succeeded on her job. Then she knew that she wanted someone with whom to share the good news. She sat down and thought of her almost forgotten plan to adopt a child. Mr. Sidney had, during his telephone proclamation, suggested, "Come down to the office tomorrow and get acquainted. Haven't got a very big force, you know, but there's a couple of stenographers, good girls, crazy to meet the new boss, and a bright new Western fellow we thought we might try out as your assistant and publicity man, and there's an office boy that's a sketch. So come down and meet your subjects, as the fellow says." Una found the office, on Duane Street, to consist of 2 real rooms and a bare anteroom decorated with photographs of the several White Line hotels, set on maple-lined streets, with the local managers, in white waistcoats, standing proudly in front. She herself was to have a big, flat-topped desk in the same room with Mr. Sidney. The surroundings were crude compared with the Truax and Fine office, but she was excited. Here she would be a pioneer. "Now come in the other room," said Mr. Sidney, "and meet the stenographers and the publicity man I was telling you about on the phone." He opened a door and said, "Mrs. Schwartz, want you shake hands with the fellow that's going to help you to put the line on the map, Mr. Babson." It was Walter Babson, who had risen from a desk and was gaping at her.
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.
Part 3, Chapter 23 of The Job. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Job by Sinclair Lewis. Part 3, Man and Woman. Chapter 23. "But I did write to you, Goldie, once more anyway. Letter was returned to me after being forwarded all over New York," said Walter, striding about her flat. "And then you forgot me completely." "No, I didn't. But what if I had? You simply aren't the same girl I liked. You're a woman that can do things, and honestly, you're an inspiration to me." Walter rubbed his jaw in the nervous way she remembered. "Well, I hope I shall inspire you to stick to the White Line and make good." "Nope. I'm going to make one more change. Gee, I can't go on working for you. The problem of any man working for a woman boss is hard enough. He's always wanting to give her advice and be superior, and yet he has to take her orders. And it's twice as hard when it's me working for you that I remember as a kid, even though you have climbed past me." "Well?" Well, I'm going to work for you till I have a job where I can make good, and when I do, or if I do, I'm going to ask you to marry me."
"But, my dear boy, I'm a businesswoman. I'm making good right now. In 3 months I've boosted White Line receipts 17%. And I'm not going back to minding the cat and the gas stove and waiting—"
"You don't need to. We can both work, keep our jobs, and have a real housekeeper, a crack-a-jack maid at $40 a month, to mind the cat."
"But you seem to forget that I'm more or less married already."
"So do you. If I make good, listen, I guess it's time now to tell you my secret. I'm breaking into your old game, real estate. You know I've been turning out pretty good publicity for the White Line, besides all the traveling and inspecting, and we have managed to have a few good times, haven't we? But also, on the side, I've been doing a whale of a lot of advertising and so on for the Nassau County Investment Company, and they've offered me a steady job at $45 a week. And now that I've got you to work for, my Wanderjahr are over. So if I do make good, will you divorce that incubus of an Eddie Schwertz and marry me? Will you?"
He perched on the arm of her chair and again demanded,
"Will you? You've got plenty legal grounds for divorcing him, and you haven't any ethical grounds for not doing it."
She said nothing. Her head drooped. She, who had blandly been his manager all day, felt managed when his "Will you?" pierced her, made her a woman. He put his forefinger under her chin and lifted it. She was conscious of his restless, demanding eyes. "Oh, I must think it over," she begged.
"Then you will!" he triumphed. "Oh, my soul, we've bucked the world. You've won, and I will win. Mr. and Mrs. Babson will be wonderfully happy. They'll be a terribly modern couple, both on the job, with a bungalow and a Ford and 2 Persian cats and a library of Wells and Compton Mackenzie and Anatole France, and everybody will think they're exceptional, and not know they're really 2 lonely kids that curl up close to each other for comfort. And now I'm going home and do a couple miles publicity for the Nassau Company. Oh, my dear, my dear."
"I will keep my job. If I've had this world of offices wished on to me, at least I'll conquer it, and give my clerks a decent time," the businesswoman meditated. "But just the same, oh, I am a woman, and I do need love. I want Walter, and I want his child, my own baby and his." End of chapter 23. Recording by Michelle Harris. End of The Job.
This audiobook is brought to you by Full Audiobooks. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon if you love audiobooks.